Lord Protector thing. So that kind of fizzled, and 2 years later, in 1660, a general who had supported Parliament, General Monk, changed his mind and invited the executed king's son and heir, Charles II, to be restored to the throne, which he did, entering London on his 30th birthday, May 29th in 1660, one of the happiest days in English history. And with Charles II, everything that had been prohibited under the Puritans came back. The theater came back, and of course, for our purposes tonight, the choir music came back. Now this was a monumental task. Think about it. Normally, in church music, whether you're dealing with adults or whether you're dealing with boys, there's a natural learning process in which the more experienced people pass on their knowledge to the less experienced people. But in 1660, there had been no choirs for 11 years, in some places more than that, because there was quite a bit of England that the Puritans had controlled from earlier. So the whole thing had to be reconstructed from scratch. Nevertheless, miraculously, they were able to do this. In fact, it's amazing that we have as much music from before then as we do. We have to be grateful to the people who preserved and resurrected it. And then, with the Restoration, we embark on what I think can be called the second golden age of Anglican choral music. The leading light of this time was Henry Purcell. Henry Purcell was born at just the right time, 1659, so right at the end of this horrible period. So he had no recollection of the Civil War, any of that nonsense. He grew up in an England which was vibrantly celebrating everything that had been previously forbidden. Purcell was what we would now call a child prodigy. By the age of 14, he was already assistant to the curator of the King's Instruments. At the age of 18, composer for the King's Violins, which was the Royal Orchestra. And at the mere age of 20, he attained the post for which he was most famous, that of organist of Westminster Abbey. Purcell was so impressive that his own teacher, John Blow, stepped aside to allow Purcell to take over at the age of 18. Now, one of Purcell's responsibilities pretty soon was to write music for the next coronation. Charles II died in 1685. He had plenty of children. Unfortunately, his wife was not the mother of any of them. So his younger brother James, who had already converted to Roman Catholicism, became monarch. James was never as popular as Charles was. In fact, once when James asked Charles why he was so lax about security, Charles said to him, "No one is ever going to kill me to make you king." This was sort of a surreal moment because it was the only time that a Roman Catholic monarch was crowned in an Anglican ceremony. He could not take communion at his own coronation. But Purcell wrote this anthem for the coronation, "I Was Glad." Now we're going to hear a slightly more familiar "I Was Glad" later on, but this is the one that Purcell composed for James II in 1685, and it's being sung here by the finest exemplar of this tradition in this country, the St. Thomas Choir of Men and Boys of New York. Now, unfortunately, this second golden age did not last very long, and it had a lot to do with the religious situation once again. James II, as I said, was a Catholic monarch crowned in an Anglican ceremony in a country which already saw itself, for the most part, as Protestant. Now, while he irritated some people, most Protestants were prepared to let this slide because his two adult daughters had been raised as Protestants. The assumption was that James' second Catholic wife, who had already had several miscarriages, was not going to have any healthy children. However, in 1688, all that changed. The very Catholic Italian Maria of Modena gave birth to a healthy son, James. All of a sudden, England faced the prospect of a permanent Roman Catholic dynasty. And this was too much for the Protestant elite in London to tolerate. When James saw that his position was untenable, he simply left, petulantly flinging the Great Seal into the Thames. Parliament invited James' daughter, Mary, and her very Protestant husband, William III of the Netherlands, who was a staunch Calvinist, to assume the throne, becoming the only joint monarchs in British history. Purcell remained prominent, composing, among other things, a funeral march for Queen Mary when she died rather prematurely in 1694. However, Purcell himself followed her to the grave the following year. And there really wasn't anyone of his caliber for quite a while. After this so-called glorious revolution, especially when the two Stuart daughters died without heirs and the Hanoverian kings were imported from Germany, the Church of England, well, there was nothing to approach the horrors of the Puritans, entered into what might be called a long, dry period. Musically, liturgically, there wasn't a lot going on. In fact, if you look at church bulletins that print birth and death dates in Anglican composers, you'll see that there's a lot of dates from the 1500s and 1600s, a lot of dates from the 1800s and 1900s, not a lot from the 1700s. This was a century where not much was happening. In 1727, the first Hanoverian king, George I, died and was succeeded by his son, 727, George II, 1727. And it perhaps says something about the condition of English music that far and away the most popular composer in England was not English at all, but had been born in Germany, the great George Frederick Handel. Coronations in the 18th century were frankly a bit of a mess. This is a wonderful description from this CD. Unfortunately, I only have time to play one excerpt from it, but again, this is another recording that seems like it was made with this talk tonight in mind. This complete reconstruction of the coronation of King George II. From the jacket we read, "By the end of September, Handel had clearly finished his new compositions. Predictably, with no instructions apparently passed to him, or perhaps they were conveniently ignored, the results come the day of the coronation were delightfully confused. The printed order at times bore little relation to what actually took place. Handel's texts in his own anthems did not match what was printed in the service paper. Several anthems were performed at different positions in the service to those officially sanctioned, and some pieces meant to be set to music apparently were not, and vice versa. The actual musical performances, too, suffered from more than a degree of disorganization. Archbishop Wake, perhaps miffed because he felt Handel had hijacked the order of service, wrote a series of caustic comments in the margin of his own service paper, commencing with, 'No anthem at all sung by the negligence of the choir of Westminster.' And against Handel's first anthem was marked the terse comment, 'The anthem all in confusion, all irregular in the music.' The lack of musical coordination on the day cannot have been helped by the performers being placed on two specially built platforms on either side of the abbey, their views interrupted by the altar. To make matters worse, 5 of the 10 boys from the Chapel Royal Choir had left with broken voices in June, and such was the duplication of adult jobs between the two musical establishments that only one singer from the abbey was not accounted for from within the ranks of the Chapel Royal Choir. But today, none of that really matters, because we have one legacy of this coronation that outshines any possible confusion at the time. And this is an anthem which I think includes perhaps the most exciting introduction and first chorus entrance ever written. Though the one piece that some of you probably could have predicted I would not dare to leave out tonight.
Do we get to sing it?
Handel's incomparable Zadok the Priest.
Oh, sure.
I say sing along.
Sing along!
Louder. It'll get louder.
It will.
This is first time I've heard this.
I would love to play the whole thing, but we need to go on. Now, the coronations did not improve much at the beginning of the 19th century when there was a farce of an entirely different kind. King George IV, who succeeded his old mad father George III in 1820, was estranged from his wife, Queen Caroline. Actually, I'm not sure you can be estranged from someone that you never liked to begin with. When George saw Caroline for the first time, it was of course an arranged marriage, the first thing he said was, "Pray get me a glass of brandy." The marriage did not improve. So when it came time to be crowned, Caroline, of course, considered herself queen, but George took the rather unusual step of barring Caroline from her own coronation. There was a supremely undignified scene in which Caroline was actually running around to the different doors of Westminster Abbey, banging on them as different guards kept her out.
That's awesome.
This did not do much for the dignity of her public image. So, we'll get back to coronations. But to set the stage for the glorious collaboration between royal ceremonial and choral music that characterized the 20th century, we need to step away from the royal court a bit to answer the question, how did Anglican church music, which was completely transformed by the end of the Victorian era, recover the high standards we take for granted today? When American Episcopalians, who are accustomed to beautiful stone churches influenced by the 19th century Gothic revival, visit the remaining colonial Anglican churches on the east coast of this country, they're often surprised at how plain they are. They don't look like what you think of as an Episcopal church. Very much more Protestant and nothing echoing the Middle Ages. Of course, in England, Anglican churches usually are from the real Middle Ages. But in the 18th century, they were kind of trying to avoid that. In parish churches, there would have been no organ and no chancel choir. Certainly no vestments like we have today. Instead of an organ and choir, there would be a band in the West Gallery at the back of the church. Now, the writer George Eliot has left, I think, a rather amusing description of what this was like. The singing was no mechanical affair of official routine. It had a drama. Then followed the migration of the clerk to the gallery, where, in company with a bassoon, two key bugles, a carpenter understood to have an amazing power of singing counter, and two lesser musical stars, he formed the complement of a choir regarded as one of distinguished attraction. The innovation of hymn books was as yet undreamed of. The greatest triumphs were reserved for the Sundays when the slate announced an anthem, in which the key bugles always ran away at a great pace, while the bassoon every now and then boomed a flying shot after them. Now, that may have been wonderful, I don't know, but it's not what we think of as traditional Anglican music. At the same time, while the cathedrals were obliged by their statutes to maintain choirs of gentlemen and boys, the standards were abysmal. Now, those of you who are at Incarnation may remember that earlier this month we sang